As we were saying in our last segment, ideas about illness vary a lot among cultures. One of the best places to see this is in illnesses that are defined by behavior, many of which come under the heading of mental illness. Mental illness is something real. Indeed, for people who experience it, it's something much more intrusive and much more debilitating than most illnesses of bones, joints, and organs. Mental illness is also something with a strong organic component. A disorder like schizophrenia, for example, manifests itself in emotions and behavior, but its root cause is clearly physical. There are disorders in the physiology and chemistry of the brain that make it happen. Now, at the same time, though, there are also dimensions of mental illness that are related to thought and experience. Depression can occur simply because of a chemical imbalance in the brain, but it can also occur because of a loss or a setback in a person's emotional life. We don't know enough about the brain to distinguish clearly between these kinds of causes. For all the research that's been done on mental illness, it's amazing how little we know about the physiological and experiential origins of particular disorders. It's also hard, very often, to draw a line between ordinary mental experience and illness. Depression's a good example. Everyone feels sad from time to time. Bad things happen to you over the course of your life, and you wouldn't be human if those didn't make you feel down at times. That kind of affect is clearly different from the experience of a clinical depression, which involves sadness at another order of magnitude. But where do you draw the line between them? How deep and how persistent does sadness have to be before we say that it's moved from the ordinary sorrow of human life to a pathological state? Do we measure it by how long it lasts? Do we measure it by the degree of misery? How can we make a clear division between these two emotional states, just regular sadness and clinical depression? The answer is that we really can't, at least right now. And in some cases, there are questions about whether something is an illness or merely a feature of personality. Take a child who's very active, who runs around all the time, doesn't like to sit still. He's so active that he has a hard time concentrating in school, where he's required to sit still in a chair for hours at a time and look at books that don't interest him. How would you describe that child? Is this someone with an energetic personality? Or is it someone who's hyperactive? Is his behavior in school that of a normal child who doesn't like sitting still, or of a child with a pathological attention deficit disorder? What about a person who likes to have things in order, who likes to line up the objects on her desk or keep the things in her refrigerator arranged alphabetically? Is that just the person's general personality? Can we just say the person likes order? Or do we define that as pathological, as obsessive behavior that calls for a diagnosis of some sort? Different people would answer these questions different ways, even in our own society. When you look across cultures, it gets harder still. Now, for that reason, we find a lot of difference among cultures in how people think about mental illness. Schizophrenia, for example, is a complex disease, one that has emotional and affective dimensions as well as cognitive ones. But clearly, one of its key features involves the perception of reality. People with schizophrenia have difficulty distinguishing between the internal workings of their own minds, their imaginations, and the objective world around them. They hear voices that aren't there. They see things that aren't there. They perceive things in their world, like hidden monsters and dangerous conspiracies that don't exist outside their imaginations. How do we conceptualize such a thing? Well, for us, of course, this is a particularly devastating illness. We live in a society with a single reality, and the ability to accurately perceive and react to that reality is critical to just about every responsible social role. A person with schizophrenia can rarely hold a responsible job or maintain an ordinary relationship. His or her behavior is erratic, unpredictable, and prone to frightening misperceptions of the people and events surrounding him or her. In some cases, medication can control these misperceptions, but the effects of those medications are often so debilitating that they make a normal life impossible. If the medications don't work, the person is often simply removed from regular society, placed in a mental institution where these voices and visions can't lead to anyone getting hurt. All this being the case, Schizophrenia is one of the most feared diagnoses in American medicine, one that seems almost inevitably to lead to poverty, social isolation, and emotional disturbance. Now, part of the reason for that, of course, has to do with our understandings of the world. For us, there is no other world out there other than the one that we can see. We live in what Max Weber, the sociologist, called the disenchanted world, one where spirits and ghosts and unseen agencies don't exist except in children's stories and horror movies. If someone sees something that we don't see, it can only be because of insanity. That's not, however, the only way you can think about the world. For many societies, the world we see out there in front of us isn't the only one that's out there. Behind the veil of physical reality lies a world of spirits, ancestors, and unseen forces, all of which have real and important effects on human existence. Much of human religion and magical practice is designed to interact with that world, to propitiate the spirits and get their assistance, or at least avoid their anger. In a culture like that, hearing voices that other people don't hear is not necessarily a sign of dysfunction. It may indeed be a gift. It may be that people who show symptoms of what we call schizophrenia have a special ability to interact with the spirit world. That ability in those cultures isn't something you lock away. It's something you cultivate, something you train, something that guides a person into a special profession. Many cultures, for example, have religious specialists who are referred to broadly by the term shaman. Now, this term originally comes from religious practices of Siberian hunter-gatherers, the Tungus people, and I don't want to give you the impression that it represents one single kind of religion all around the world. Actually, shamanism takes a lot of different forms in a lot of different cultures, and people have suggested, a lot of anthropologists have suggested that the word shamanism is actually quite misleading because it suggests a uniformity that isn't there. What all these cultures have in common, though, is the idea that the shaman is an intermediary, someone who can move between the visible and the invisible worlds. In a lot of cases, shamans are involved in healing because people believe that illness results from something going wrong in the unseen world. Shamans can also be involved in divination and prophecy, carrying messages from the spirits back to ordinary people. You can find versions of this role in the shamans of Native America, the witch doctors of East Africa, the wise women and wise men of Northern Europe, and even in the leaders of some mystical religious movements here in the United States. Now, the anthropologist George Devereux, who had worked with shamans in a large number of cultures, argued that virtually all of those he had met would have qualified for a diagnosis of schizophrenia in the United States. Their symptoms, hearing voices that other people didn't, going into trance, living part way between the seen and unseen worlds, would have been understood in our society as a pathological disorder of brain neurology, one that would almost inevitably lead to isolation, stigma, poverty, and early death. In a society with shamanism, however, there's another alternative. It's not that shamans are normal people, far from it. In most cases, shamans are seen as fairly strange and uncanny people who often live rather odd and marginal lives. But that oddness comes along with a value and a power that's associated with an important social role. And it isn't illness. Rooted in a different set of ideas about the nature of reality, the same set of symptoms can manifest as a completely different thing. Now, on a concrete level, these sorts of differences can result in misunderstandings when cultures come together. You know, in the reading I assigned for this lecture, you'll see the description of the case of the Lees, an immigrant family from Laos who came to California in the 1970s. Their youngest child, named Leah, began experiencing seizures when she was about 3 months old. Now, from the viewpoint of American medicine, the seizures had a straightforward cause, epilepsy. The Lees, however, interpreted the seizures from the standpoint of their traditional Hmong medical system, which had a different explanation for where these came from. For them, seizures and epilepsy was related to the soul, right? It involved an instability of the soul in the body. And people who suffered from it often grew up to be shamans and healers. The specific issue causing the seizures in this case, for the Lees, could be diagnosed pretty easily, was soul loss. A door had been slammed close to the child at one point, and fear of the noise had driven the child's soul out of her. The appropriate remedy was to bring in the shaman to trap the lost soul and return it to her body. But living as they did in the United States, they were worried about her and they didn't want to overlook the possibility of modern medicine being able to help. So they brought her into the emergency room and described the situation. It talks about it in the book. What followed could be called a comedy of errors if the result hadn't been so tragic. Right, the doctors couldn't really understand what the Lees were saying, and they misdiagnosed Leah's situation as infection. They prescribed medications for it and explained how to use them, something which the parents really didn't understand because they couldn't understand the language that they were being spoken to in. When the seizures returned a few months later, the child was brought back to the hospital and subjected to an extensive battery of invasive and often painful tests, ranging from spinal taps to CAT scans, none of which made any sense at all to the Lees. Over the next several years, she wound up in the hospital 17 times and was given 23 different prescriptions, none of which her parents really understood and none of which they could administer properly. Now, eventually, the doctors decided that the parents weren't administering the medicines correctly and that their doing so constituted child neglect or child abuse. And so they contacted authorities who removed Leah from her family and placed her in foster care for a year at the age of 4.5. This obviously is traumatic for both the child and the family. It did not improve her symptoms. They never got any better. And eventually, after a year or so, she was returned to her parents. The medical treatments, however, continued, and ultimately, while she was in the hospital, she caught an infection, which led to a massive seizure, which wound up leaving her in a permanent vegetative state. The doctors expected her to die shortly afterwards. The parents at that point, though, brought her home and applied traditional remedies. Perhaps because of those, she continued to live on in a vegetative state that they attributed to the loss of her soul. Years later, they still continued to hope that a traditional healer might be able to coax her soul back into her body so that she could come back to them. Now, Lee's story is drawn from a book by Anne Fadiman called The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down, which I'd really strongly recommend to you if you're interested in this kind of thing. It's a very good and ultimately tragic example of the kinds of misunderstanding and dysfunctions that can occur when cultural models of disease and illness run into one another. One of the key goals of medical anthropology is to try to find ways to keep that from happening. The more that we can educate both medical professionals and patients about the different ways that people think about the body and illness, the better able we will be to promote the healthy outcomes to illness that all of us really want.